Hi there. Today we're going to talk about poetry, and I know a lot of people, when they hear poetry, instantly want to groan because they just don't know what to do with it, and they might want to enjoy poetry, but they have difficulty trying to figure out what to do with it. So before we get into analyzing poetry, I think it's important to take a few minutes and figure out how do we just approach poetry. And I have a 4-step approach for poetry without fear. Well, without too much fear, anyway. Now, most people go about this all the wrong way. They just dive straight into the poem. They read it. They don't really understand it. They start trying to analyze it from the first line, and they just end up extremely frustrated. And that's exactly what we don't want to do. We don't want to be frustrated, and so we need a method. And this means we have to take a little time. Most people get confused. They think a poem is really short. They should be able to understand it very quickly. In fact, it's almost quite the opposite. It's very short and it takes a lot of time to understand, so we need to really take the time to figure out what's going on in it. So here is my 4-step approach for learning how to approach a poem, my method. Okay, first of all, you read it, then you hear it, you define it, and then you dive into it. All right. So with anything that's a method, there's a certain discipline to it. There's a practice that you need to develop. Okay. It's like doing any skill. You need to practice it a bit first before you get good at it. Once you get good at it, then it just becomes quite natural. So I found that this works very well with my classes. First thing to do when you have a poem in front of you is obviously just read it. Read it silently to yourself. At least twice. Okay? It's a poem is a very compact, dense piece of work. Every word counts. And you really need to take the time to interact with the text and deal with it and think about it. So read it to yourself at least twice. That's going to take a few minutes, but it's going to pay off in the end. Then this is really important, and this is a step that a lot of people skip, is you need to hear the poem. So, because poems are about sounds, it's not just about the words, it's also about how the sounds combine. Once we hear it, then we can start hearing rhyme and rhythm more easily. We can maybe pick up some literary devices that we maybe didn't notice just when we read it to ourselves silently. So there's a couple different ways you can approach this. You can either read it aloud to yourself, although sometimes it's nicer to have someone read it to you or find a version online that's being read aloud. Very often, particularly with more modern poems, you can find the author himself or herself reading the poem aloud. If you go to YouTube or Vimeo, you can usually find a version of more modern poems being read by the author himself or herself, which is quite special. When I did Shakespearean sonnets with my 12th graders a couple of years ago, we found some professional actors reading some of the sonnets, and that was very exciting because it added a whole new dimension to the understanding of the poem when you heard someone who's very well versed in Shakespearean literature reading it. Don't worry, we're not going to do any Shakespearean sonnets. We finished our Shakespeare for the year, but this is a really important step that most people skip, and that's hearing the poem. Once you've heard it, you're going to have already a much better idea of what's going on. But every word counts in poetry, okay? Every word is important. In a novel, you can put words in, and if there's like a couple extra words, it's not going to hurt anybody, it's not going to kill anybody. In a poem, every single word is important. So if there is a word that you are not 100% sure of, you must take the time to look that word up and define it. Okay, you might go like, yeah, I'm pretty familiar with that word, but maybe I'm not quite sure how they're using it here. You need to look it up. If you're saying, oh, I've never seen that word before, you definitely need to look it up. Now, we'll all look up different words and different numbers of words. That's okay. Some of us are still learning English. You're probably going to have a few more words to look up. That's just fine. If English is your native language, though, don't think you're going to get away with not looking anything up. There are still going to be words that you need to stop and take a closer look at. And by stopping and looking more closely at these words, they're probably keywords if you don't understand them. And that's going to help you get a much better idea of what's going on in the poem. Once you've done that, take a final reread of the poem. Okay? Then and only then are we ready to dive in. Okay, I like to use this metaphor of a swimming pool. You don't just dive in when you get to a pool. You don't just throw yourself in the pool. If you want to dive in, there's a certain method you take, and that's what we've done here. If you're going to dive into a pool, our swimmers can tell us all about this. You get ready, you limber up, you stretch, you take a deep breath, you pay attention to what you're doing, and you make a nice smooth dive into the pool. You don't just throw yourself from the top board and then land on your belly. That's going to hurt. And that's what most of us do, however, when we're approaching poetry. We just slam belly first into the water and then wonder why it hurts. So this way, using this 4-point approach of read it, hear it, define it, and then dive in, that gives you the chance to really limber up, loosen up your brain a little bit, and be a bit more relaxed and open to understanding the poetry. In the next presentation, we'll take a close look at the diving in part, because that's where you really want to start doing the analysis, and that takes a bit more close attention. But for now, what I'd like you to do is practice with the poem In Flanders Fields by John McCrae. You'll find the poem on the wiki. It was written in World War I by a British soldier. And you may have already read the poem, you may know it quite well, but I want to take a closer look at it even so. So do that with this poem. Read it to yourself at least twice, then hear it, and then define it. I think I will put a link on the wiki as well where you can hear an original reading of the poem. If not, you can read it to yourself aloud, or you can have someone in the class stand up and read it for you.